Hello, I'm Ajai Shukla, a former colonel from the Indian Army, and I'm going to talk to you today about what continues to divide Beijing and Delhi, the Sino-Indian border dispute. Now, people commonly talk about the unsettled border between India and China as a boundary dispute, but it's actually much more than that. In fact, it's a territorial dispute in which both sides lay claim to some 135,000 square kilometers of disputed territory. Now, this territory is spread across three widely separated sectors. The first of them is the western sector. In the western sector, which includes Ladakh's borders with Tibet and Xinjiang, the primary bone of contention is the barren, uninhabited, high-altitude desert plateau of Aksai Chin. It measures, this figure is only a rough figure, some 35,000 square kilometers. For China, the Aksai Chin came to have major strategic value after the communist government built the strategic Western Highway through this area that connects Tibet and Xinjiang. Nehru recognized that the Aksai Chin had little strategic value for India, but it had become a political hot potato. This was highlighted in an exchange in Parliament on 5th December 1961, a year before the Sino-Indian War. Nehru was trying to talk down the value of Aksai Chin to India. He told Parliament, no tree grows anywhere in this wide area. There may be some shrubs. At that, veteran Congress leader Mahavir Tyagi pointed to his own bald head and said, no hair grows on my head. Does it mean that the head has no value? Now, that was the bone of contention between India and China. Besides Aksai Chin, there's also a dispute in the western sector over a 500 square kilometer pocket of land near Demchok. That's slightly to the south. China claims in this sector actually increased between December 1959, when Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, presented a map that he said was 3 years old, and the officials' dialogue that took place in 1960, when these claim lines advanced even further westwards. In the 1962 war, China physically occupied the territory that they claimed in this 1960 map, including around the Pangong and Spangur lakes, in the Chipchap River and the Galwan River valleys, and around Demchok. China still continues its occupation of these areas. It amounts to an estimated 3,000 square kilometers. Finally, rounding off the dispute in the western sector to about 44,000 square kilometers is the Shuksgam Valley. That's about 5,000 square kilometers of high-altitude territory north of the Siachen Glacier, which Pakistan ceded to China as part of a border agreement in 1963, illegally. This provisional agreement is subject to the final settlement of the J&K border dispute between Pakistan and India. Now, the other sector is the central sector. This includes the Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand border with Tibet. There's a relatively minor dispute of about 2,000 square kilometers here. This relates to the alignment of the border in the Barahuti plains. That's a gap in the Himalayan wall between India and Tibet. Most analysts assess that this will not be difficult to resolve. That's the central sector dispute, once there's agreement between India and China on the western and eastern sectors. Now, coming on to the eastern sector. Now, this is the major portion of the dispute. It lies between the border of Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet, earlier called NIFA, the Northeast Frontier Agency, where India claims the border runs broadly along the Himalayan watershed, along what is called the McMahon Line. China's claim is ambiguous here. It says the dispute here is over 90,000 square kilometers of territory. But in fact, the whole of Arunachal Pradesh, which China claims as South Tibet, is less than 84,000 square kilometers. And Chinese maps show just about 65,000 square kilometers of Arunachal as Chinese. So it's unclear where these missing 25,000 square kilometers as claimed by China lie. Now, other than a couple of small pockets like Tawang, China has never in recorded history administered the bulk of Arunachal Pradesh. So why does it claim so much territory, 90,000 square kilometers, over which it has a really unconvincing case? Several Chinese and Indian experts believe that Beijing claims Arunachal since the late 1950s in order to have a bargaining lever, to make India relinquish its claim over the Aksai Chin in return for Arunachal, or South Tibet as China calls it. Now, the eastern sector also encompasses the 220-kilometer long border between Sikkim and Tibet, which is in fact the only settled part of the entire Indian border with China. This was settled under the Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1890. 5 years later, it was jointly demarcated on the ground. China's communist government confirmed this position in a formal note to New Delhi in 1959. But even here, there are small disputes about where the border actually runs. So the big question, how did this territorial dispute originate? For thousands of years, the Great Himalayan Wall and other equally formidable mountain ranges like the Karakoram and the Kunlun had separated the Indian subcontinent from Tibet and China to its north and northeast. In earlier times, civilizations, countries, empires were separated by territorial buffers, which, like in the India-China case, were tracts of extremely difficult terrain where neither country wielded real power or maintained a significant military or administrative presence. Typically, a ruler's influence shaded off gradually as one journeyed further away from the heartland and into this buffer zone. At some point, this influence ceased to be tangible at all, and then as one continued journeying, the next ruler's influence would gradually start manifesting itself, growing in strength as it approached its center. For over 2,000 years, the Indian, Chinese, and Tibetan civilizations and kingdoms flourished like this, separated by mountain walls, inhospitable terrain, linked only by intrepid monks and traders who journeyed between them. Now, this was disrupted by the arrival of two expansionist colonial powers that perceived each other as rivals. First, Great Britain in the mid-18th century in India expanded northwards and westwards up to Afghanistan and the doorstep of Central Asia. Advancing in the opposite direction from north to south was Tsarist Russia. For 4 centuries, Russia had expanded at the rate of 55 square miles every day. That is 20,000 square miles per year. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Russian soldiers and horsemen expanded eastwards across the vast Siberian landmass, bringing millions of square miles under St. Petersburg. Then in the 19th century, the Russian troops turned south, advancing through the Caucasus and subjugating the great khanates of Central Asia. When the 19th century began, Britain and Russia were 2,000 kilometers apart in Asia. By the end of the 19th century, British and Russian outposts in the Pamirs were just 20 kilometers apart. In many cases, the bulk of them were 200 kilometers apart. Countering each other through expeditions, explorers, and expansion of influence all the way to the borders and beyond became a key preoccupation of London and St. Petersburg. The so-called Great Game played between Britain and Russia had changed the traditional idea of the border here. Now let's look at some events in the western sector. Afghanistan, the areas around Peshawar and the Punjab, were now Britain's front lines in the Great Game. In establishing its control over these areas, the British fought 2 wars in Afghanistan, one of them disastrous, and 2 wars against the Sikh Empire. Through the Treaty of Lahore on the 9th of March 1846, the defeated Sikhs ceded Kashmir to the East India Company. Now, for the first time in this area, the British had a frontier with China, since Tibet was under Beijing's control or suzerainty. A week later, in the Treaty of Amritsar, 16th March 1846, the British sold Jammu and Kashmir to the Dogra ruler, Gulab Singh, for 75 lakh rupees, a good bargain. London wanted to position China, at least in Xinjiang and Tibet, as a buffer against expansionist Russia. Britain therefore supported China's claim of suzerainty over Tibet. Now, self-servingly, London followed this supportive policy towards Beijing only in its outlying western provinces of Xinjiang and Tibet, which were at the center of the Great Game with Russia. In the eastern provinces of the Chinese heartland, Britain continued pushing its commercial interests by imposing predatory trade practices on Beijing. To support China, the British explicitly prohibited the J&K Maharaja Gulab Singh from further territorial expansion. Article 4 of the Treaty of Amritsar states, "The limits of territories of Maharaja Gulab Singh shall not at any time change without concurrence of the British government." Now, Britain departed from this policy of supporting China's position only in periods where Chinese control over the territories had almost totally collapsed, and it was therefore unable to play the role of a buffer state at all, and this happened often because the Chinese empire was weakening. Another clause in the Treaty of Amritsar promoted a stable and well-defined border with China. Article 2 of the treaty envisaged setting up a boundary commission to identify the border between Ladakh and Tibet. Britain wanted this stable border. Even at that time, there were existing treaties that would help in defining a Ladakh-Tibet border. In 1841-42, a Dogra army led by Zorawar Singh had invaded Tibet in an attempt to gain control of the Pashmina wool and shawl trade. It was repelled after some early successes, and hostilities were concluded by an 1842 treaty that reaffirmed the old established frontiers between Ladakh and Tibet. These frontiers had been affirmed earlier in a 1684 treaty, which also located the border at the Ladi stream close to Demchok, where it is today, but did not indicate its further alignment to the north or south. Now, when the British proposed surveying and demarcating this new border, the Chinese and Tibetans gave an evasive response. They thought they would be taken to the market by the British. So British surveyors carried out a unilateral survey in 1846 and again in 1847. That London and New Delhi wanted a stable border with China is evident from the instructions given to the boundary commissioners. It said, the commissioners should, and I quote, bear in mind that it is not a strip of more or less barren or even productive territory that we want, but a clear and well-defined boundary. In the absence of Chinese and Tibetan participation, the boundary commissions of 1846 and 1847 identified the traditional or customary Ladakh-Tibet border from Spiti all the way up to the Pangong Lake as perceived by local inhabitants and established by revenue and administrative records. North of the Pangong Lake and the Changchenmo Valley, the situation regarding survey was far more difficult. Now, this is the vast stony desert often referred to as the Aksai Chin, although the name properly applies only to the northeastern extremity of this area. This area was infrequently traversed by traders or nomadic herders and had virtually no settled population. Revenue and administrative records were correspondingly sparse, and the identification of the border in this inhospitable region was definitely, as you can imagine, problematic. Over the years, the British set out two versions of the boundary line here. There was an expansive version where the boundary followed the Kunlun Range. Now, this was proposed during periods where Britain followed a forward border policy, where it expanded its frontiers. At other times, especially when London was concerned about the feasibility and cost of manning a forward border, it proposed a more conservative border based on the Karakoram Range. Now, the first to produce a border alignment was a Survey of India official William Johnson in 1865. He placed the border along the Kunlun Range, that's an expansive border, putting the whole of the Aksai Chin in Kashmir. Later in 1897, a British military officer, Major General Sir John Ardagh, who was then the Director of Military Intelligence in London, proposed a slight modification of the Johnson Line, but with the border still running along the Kunlun Range. This alignment therefore was given the name the Johnson-Ardagh Line. The Johnson delegation was the basis of the British India map of 1947, but it was by no means the only British depiction of the Ladakh-Tibet border. In 1899, during a period of great alarm over Russia's designs in the Karakoram Knot region, the British made a formal proposal to China of a boundary agreement in which China would give up tenuous claims to Hunza and would receive in return a boundary running eastward from the Karakoram Pass for about half a degree and then running south to a little below the 35th degree parallel and so on. Now, in effect, this would divide the Aksai Chin region between British India and China's Tibet and Xinjiang region. The China failed to make a specific response to this proposal, which the British soon shelved. But this abortive proposal is worth noticing if only because it illustrates that an imperial power is apt to sacrifice the traditional boundary alignment for what it might view in certain point in time as strategic considerations. Now, the 1899 line, the so-called MacDonald-Macartney line, therefore did not reflect the customary or traditional border. It was reflective of a geopolitical game at a particular point in time. Thus, British border policy fluctuated till 1907, when the great game itself ended with Britain and Russia signing the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, in which they agreed to respect the status quo ante in Tibet and to deal with Tibet only through Beijing. So in effect, independent India inherited from Britain a Ladakh-Tibet border that was never agreed to by both sides. The Survey of India maps at the time of independence depicted the Aksai Chin in color wash as undefined. Only in 1954 did India make a decision to replace these maps with new ones that showed the boundary as fixed and following the Johnson-Arda alignment. That's the expansive alignment in which Aksai Chin was wholly a part of India. Now, in doing so, the government of India committed itself to a forward policy, which it did not have the military resources to enforce, and which became a matter of national prestige, as exemplified by Mahavir Tyagi's bald head. Let's go over to the eastern sector now. In the eastern sector, where there was no Russian threat and no great game, a contested border emerged all the same. How did this happen? It began with the rise of Gurkha power in 1769, when the Gurkhas overthrew the Mewar rulers of Nepal and established a Hindu kingdom there. Now, this broke down ties between Nepal and Tibet and the closure of traditional trade links through the Himalayan passes between Nepal and Tibet. With the British completely shut out of Nepal for having supported the Mewars against the Gurkhas, now they began exploring alternative routes to Tibet, and Sikkim emerged as the best possible option. Now, continuing tensions with the Gurkhas led to the Anglo-Nepalese War of 1814-1816. After a British victory, the 1816 Treaty of Sigauli saw the hill areas of Kumaon and Garhwal being ceded to the British. Now, that was what gave British India its first common frontier with Tibet. But the Gurkhas were attacking neighboring Sikkim as well, making it difficult for the British to access Tibet through that territory. So in 1817, the British signed the Treaty of Titalia with Sikkim, providing it British protection in exchange for placing its foreign relations under British control. This was reinforced by a new treaty in 1861, which solidified British control and made Sikkim the main conduit for Britain's Tibet policy. The British advanced even further east in the 1820s, when Burma conquered Manipur and parts of Assam following the weakening of the Ahom kingdom. After the Anglo-Burmese War of 1824-26, the landmark Treaty of Yandabo in 1826 gave the British all of Lower Assam and parts of Upper Assam as well, including what is now Arunachal Pradesh. For the British, this opened up a range of options. Not only was Assam rich in resources, but the no man's land north of it opened up the possibility of alternative routes to Tibet and southwest China. In 1886, for the first time, a British expedition went up the Lohit Valley in Arunachal. Over the succeeding decades, the British established a tributary relationship with the tribes in the mountainous areas of Assam without establishing an administration in those remote regions. Now, this so-called Pacific policy of non-interference was first announced in 1865. With the Chinese Qing Empire in terminal decline, Britain's entry into this area encountered no opposition from across the border. Its challenge was mainly to establish relations and peace with the hill tribes in the mountains and adjoining Assam, which Britain was successful in doing. Now, these hill regions came to be classified as excluded areas, and terra incognita north of Assam was called the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NIFA. This stable British expansion into Assam was rudely jolted by the arrival of a viceroy, George Nathaniel Curzon, who was a firm believer in the need for a British forward policy. By the turn of the century, the declining Chinese empire's slipping hold on Tibet, the fiction of Chinese power, as Curzon called it, convinced him that the field was open for Russia to control Tibet, and therefore Britain needed to move first to preempt Russia. The result was the Young Husband expedition in 1903-1904, a military conquest of Tibet with the aim of establishing some sort of British protectorate. The military aims were achieved, with Young Husband capturing Lhasa and imposing a treaty on the Tibetan government. But London, with its eye on the big picture, was having none of it. The great game with Russia was winding down. The British government walked away from Young Husband's treaty. In 1906, the Anglo-Chinese Adhesion Agreement restored a policy of British non-interference in Tibet's affairs, provided Lhasa excluded all other European powers from its territory. The powers of the Chinese Amban, its nominal governor in Lhasa, were restored in 1906. Now this maneuvering all became redundant in 1907, remember, when the Anglo-Russian Convention agreed to leave Tibet in that state of isolation from which he has shown no intention to depart, and whereby Britain and Russia agreed not to enter into negotiations with Tibet except through the intermediary of the Chinese government. But the problem remained. The Chinese empire was collapsing. Like the last flicker of a dying candle, the period 1907 to 11 saw a resurgence of Chinese power around Tibet. The Sichuanese warlord Tao Feng, or Butcher Chow as he was called, started expanding his influence quite independent of the Qing Empire. He invaded Tibet and to British alarm started probing into areas in Pemako, close to the Himalayan border with northern Assam. Now for Britain this was alarming. Clearly there was a need to assert British presence in the border areas. Therefore the period 1911 to 13 saw the first major British expeditions to explore the tribal mountainous areas, such as the Mishmi expedition. And then suddenly China's presence just disappeared. The Qing Empire collapsed in 1912. The next year Tibet declared independence. It attacked the residual Chinese forces in Tibet, which fled into Lhasa over the Nathula Pass in Sikkim. Now Britain clearly needed to define boundaries, and in 1913 it convened the Simla Conference. This was a boundary negotiation between the big words, plenipotentiary representatives of British India. That was Sir Henry McMahon, Republican China, who was Ifan Chen, and Tibet, who was the Longchen Chatra. Now the principal aim of the Simla Conference was to determine the boundary between inner and outer Tibet, that is, areas under Chinese administration and those under Tibetan control. The Simla Conference eventually resulted in the production of two maps. One showed the boundary between inner and outer Tibet, that was the primary aim, marked by a blue line, as well as the boundary between outer Tibet and India, which was marked by a red line. Now this map was initialed by each of the three plenipotentiaries, but later rejected by China. It's noteworthy that the stated grounds for rejection by China, this is by the Chinese Memorandum of 13 June 1914, related principally to the delineation of the boundary between inner and outer Tibet, not the boundary with India. The second map depicted only the India-Tibet boundary, and this was in greater detail. Copies of this map were exchanged only between the British and Tibetan plenipotentiaries, together with a formal exchange of letters on 24-25 March 1914. The India-Tibet boundary in the Simla map, which has come to be known as the McMahon Line, reflected topography as well as administrative realities. Tibetan administration had never extended south of this line except in the Tawang area. Tawang remained under the control of Tibetan monastic authorities until 1951, when India finally extended its administration to this area. Now, with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the British government had very little mind space or time or resources for implementing the McMahon Line. The interwar years were a period of European turmoil, and then the outbreak of the Second World War occupied British attention. Besides, China was never a threat during this period. It was embroiled in civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and in fighting the Japanese invasion. There was also the risk of attracting Russian objections on the grounds of the 1907 Anglo-Russian Treaty, which mandated British non-interference in Tibet. So it was only in 1936 that Whitehall was persuaded to publish the full texts of the 1914 Simla Convention. And in 1937, for the first time, Survey of India maps showed the McMahon Line as the official boundary. However, it was left to independent India to actually implement the agreement. Now, coming to the independent India part of it, given the ambiguous borders inherited from the British, a territorial dispute between India and China was near inevitable. The two new Asian powers, both emerging from extended domination by foreign powers and acutely conscious of their respective civilizational heritage and potential power, were never likely to compromise on what they perceived as rightfully theirs. confrontation became even more inevitable as China's military invaded Tibet in 1950 and quickly ran into serious opposition against its so-called democratic reforms, which was actually the imposition of communism on a deeply religious Tibetan society, polity, and culture. Setting the stage for war was the grant of Indian asylum to the Dalai Lama when he escaped from Tibet, and also the flat refusal of Indian leaders to negotiate a mutual border with China. The result was war. Now, for the next 8 years after 1962, dialogue between India and China was absolutely frozen. Only in 1970 did Chairman Mao tell the acting Indian ambassador in Beijing, Brajesh Misra, "How long are we going to keep on quarreling like this? Let's be friends again." So Mao sent his compliments to India's president and to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi through Brajesh Misra. Yet, with India drawing close to the Soviet Union in 1971 and China supporting Pakistan in its Bangladesh misadventure, it was a long time before dialogue actually began. Even so, China continued signaling it was ready for a settlement along the lines that Chou En-lai had proposed in 1960 to Nehru. This proposal involved an east for west settlement, in which India accepted China's claims in the western sector, that's in Aksai Chin, in exchange for Chinese acceptance of India's claim over Nifa, or Arunachal Pradesh as it was now called. In 1982, Deng Xiaoping signaled in an interview that an east for west offer still remained on the table. But 3 years later, in 1985, China said that India would also have to make meaningful concessions in the east, that's in Nifa or Arunachal. In 1985, for the first time, China explicitly demanded that India hand over Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh as an indispensable component of a border settlement. It was Rajiv Gandhi's visit to Beijing in December 1988 that saw the next major step in border negotiations. It was decided then to set up a joint working group on the boundary settlement and to finalize an agreement to ensure peace on the borders. Eventually, that resulted in the landmark agreement to maintain peace and tranquility on the LAC, which was signed during Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's visit to Beijing in 1993. It was also agreed that the joint working groups would take up the task of clarifying the alignment of the LAC. This was a task so problematic that it still hasn't been concluded. Now, supplementing the 1993 Peace and Tranquility Agreement, an agreement on confidence-building measures on the LAC was signed 3 years later in 1996. Now, these agreements significantly have held through even the most trying times, including the recent Doklam standoff. Not a shot has been exchanged on the Sino-Indian border since 1975. The next major boost to border negotiations took place in 2003, when Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee visited Beijing. The two sides agreed then to appoint special representatives of the top leadership to explore from the perspective of the overall bilateral relationship the framework of a boundary settlement. Since then, more than 20 rounds of negotiations have been held between the special representatives. In 2005, they achieved a breakthrough with an agreement on political parameters and guiding principles for solving the boundary question. That was signed during Premier Wen Jiabao's visit to India in 2005. Now, this agreement, the Political Principles Agreement, was advantageous for India because it referred to easily identifiable geographical features, which actually supports the watershed-based McMahon Line boundary. It also specifies the safeguarding of due interests of settled populations in the border areas, which would suggest avoiding disrupting the status quo in Tawang. China had resisted these formulations earlier, but by 2005, the US-India relationship was becoming worrying for Beijing, so perhaps it gave in for that reason. During Wen's visit, the China also released a new official map that showed Sikkim as a part of India. Now, that was a small but unprecedented breakthrough, and the only one so far. Since then, however, there's been little forward motion on the boundaries. India's military has built up a formidable presence on the LAC, and it would be difficult today for China to win a clear military victory as it did in 1962. Besides, with both sides now patrolling the LAC aggressively, there is a danger that patrol confrontations might one day lead to an armed clash and the spilling of blood. There have been major patrol confrontations in Daulat Beg Oldi in 2013, in Chumar in 2014, and in Doklam in 2017, which were fortunately diffused without bloodshed. But the threat of an armed clash will hang over the LAC until there's a final settlement. Thank you.